You know how some empires make it into every history book, and others just vanish? Well, tonight we're not talking about the ones everyone remembers. Not Rome, not Greece, not even Genghis Khan. We're talking about the Tatars, the name that once made Europe tremble. The horsemen who rode like shadows, who left cities in ash and kings in silence. The ones who weren't just a tribe, but a force that redrew the map. And yet, somehow, most people have no idea who they really were. Ask around today, and the word Tatar might mean anything. Some think it's a food. Others confuse it with tartar sauce. A few recall something about the Mongols. Fewer still know they existed at all. But 500 years ago, their name was carved into fear itself. Entire villages in Eastern Europe prayed they wouldn't hear hoofbeats on the horizon. Mothers told their children to behave, or the Tatars would take them. They weren't just warriors. They were myth. They were prophecy. And the strange part is, they didn't disappear. They're still here. You'll find Tatars in Kazan, in Crimea, in Turkey, in parts of Central Asia. They live in cities, they speak many languages, they carry passports. But buried deep in their bloodline is a story that most of the world has forgotten, or was never taught in the first place. So tonight we're digging it up, all of it. The rise, the terror, the golden empires, the betrayals, the broken thrones, and the stubborn survival of a people too wild to disappear. But first, we ride back, all the way back to where this began. Before there were kingdoms, before there were maps. The Eurasian steppe is a strange place. It's not a desert, but it behaves like one. No trees, no borders, just wind, grass, and a horizon that doesn't end. For thousands of years, it's been home to people who don't build walls, because walls don't work out there. Instead, they lived on horses, slept under stars, moved with the seasons, and if something got in their way, they rode through it. This was the birthplace of the Nomads, and among them were the ones we now call the Tatars. At first, Tatar wasn't a nation. It was a name whispered by their neighbors. Chinese scribes mentioned them as early as the 5th century, a scattered group of tribes beyond the Great Wall. Not quite Mongol, not quite Turk, just fast, deadly, and unpredictable. They were a mosaic of clans. Some worshipped the sky, some the ancestors, others just believed in survival. They didn't write books. They wrote in raids, in scars, in the silence that followed their horses. And then came the fire that changed everything. His name was Temujin. You know him better as Genghis Khan. He didn't just unite the Mongols, he united the steppe. And along the way, the Tatars became part of that machine. But it wasn't peaceful. The early Tatars were actually rivals of the young Genghis. In fact, he blamed them for poisoning his father. As a boy, he watched his world fall apart because of Tatar treachery. So when he came to power, he remembered. He wiped out their leadership, scattered their tribes, forced them into submission. But he didn't erase them. He absorbed them. He took their warriors, their skills, their speed, their language, and soon, Tatar stopped being a single tribe and started being a name the world gave to the Mongol storm. When Mongol armies thundered into Eastern Europe, burning cities and crushing armies, the people who survived didn't call them Mongols, they called them Tatars. That word stuck, and it would haunt Europe for centuries. But what most people miss is this. The Tatars weren't just mindless soldiers in someone else's empire. After Genghis died, his empire fractured, split among his sons and grandsons, and out in the western frontiers, something new was born. A new Tatar world. Led by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, the Mongols surged into Russia and Eastern Europe. They leveled Kyiv. They scorched Poland and Hungary. And then they stopped. They didn't need to keep going. They had already built something massive, the Golden Horde. It wasn't just a camp, it was a kingdom. Stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Black Sea, from Siberia to the edge of the Danube. Millions of people lived under it. Slavs, Turks, Persians, Armenians, Georgians, even some Italians. It was a multicultural, multilingual web of control, held together not by walls, but by riders. At its peak, the Golden Horde was one of the most powerful forces in the world, and its heart was Tatar. The Horde's rulers were descended from Genghis, but they spoke Turkic. They married local nobility. They adopted Islam. They built cities like Sarai, a glittering capital along the Volga that rivaled Baghdad in size. Merchants came from Venice, Cairo, and Delhi. Scholars wrote in Arabic, Persian, and Kipchak. It wasn't chaos, it was order, of a very different kind. But it wasn't gentle. The Horde demanded tribute from the Russian principalities. If a prince didn't pay, cities burned, heads rolled, entire populations vanished. It was called the Tatar yoke, and for over 200 years, Russian rulers lived under it. But the Tatars weren't just feared. They were respected, even admired. They mastered diplomacy. They balanced power. They let different faiths exist as long as loyalty came first. Some Christian princes preferred Tatar rule to their own neighbors. It was brutal, but it was predictable. And in the steppe, predictability was rare. But nothing lasts forever. As centuries passed, the Horde began to fracture. Civil wars, ambitious generals, changing trade routes, the Black Death, each one chipped away at the power of the Tatars. By the late 1300s, the once united Golden Horde had splintered into rival khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, Sibir, each still powerful, each still Tatar. But the unity was gone, and waiting in the shadows as was Moscow. That's a story for the next chapter. The fall of an empire never happens in one night. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it's a slow leak, not a fire, but a fade. And that's how the Golden Horde began to break. On the outside, they still ruled a massive territory. Cities like Sarai still stood. Riders still collected tribute. Princes still bowed. But underneath, the seams were splitting. The world was changing. Trade routes had shifted. The Black Death had emptied cities and left fear in its place. The center of the world was moving, away from the steppes, away from caravans and open roads, toward ports, oceans, and empires built on ships instead of saddles. But the Tatars weren't paying attention. Instead, they were turning on each other. The sons of the Horde, each claiming the blood of Genghis Khan, fought among themselves. City fought city, Khan fought Khan, and every time they spilled their own blood, the empire shrank a little more. And in the north, someone else was watching. Moscow. What had once been just another tribute-paying town under Tatar rule had changed. Its princes had grown rich off trade, smart off politics. They had learned how the Horde ruled and how to outlast them. They paid when they had to, fought when it was safe, and waited, patiently. Then in 1380 the waiting stopped. On a quiet plain called Kulikovo, a Russian prince named Dmitri, later called Donskoy, faced the Tatar army in open battle. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a shock. For the first time, a Russian army had stood up to the horde and lived. That battle didn't end the Tatar yoke, but it cracked it. After Kulikovo, other Russian cities started pulling away. They still feared the Tatars, but they no longer believed they were invincible. Then in 1480, something happened that felt like the end of a myth. The standoff at the Ugra River. No swords crossed, no arrows flew. Two armies faced each other, and then the Tatars turned back. Just like that, the Tatar grip over Russia was broken. It had lasted over 2 centuries. But even as Moscow rose, the Tatars didn't vanish. They splintered. What used to be the Golden Horde became a collection of khanates, smaller regional powers, still dangerous, still Tatar. The Kazan Khanate ruled the Volga. The Crimean Khanate ruled the Black Sea. The Astrakhan Khanate held the south. The Sibir Khanate ruled the edge of Siberia. Each had its own ruler, army, allies, and enemies, and each still claimed the legacy of the horde. But now they were no longer alone in the north. Russia wasn't a collection of weak principalities anymore. It had become an empire, one that didn't forget who had ruled them for 200 years. And when Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, became Tsar, he wanted revenge. In 1552, he marched on Kazan. It wasn't just a war, it was a statement. Kazan was a Tatar city, a symbol, a capital, a place where mosques and markets stood tall, where steppe culture mixed with Islamic architecture and ancient bloodlines. And Ivan burned it to the ground. The siege of Kazan was brutal. Cannons thundered, walls collapsed, bodies filled the river. Tens of thousands died, women, children, nobles, scholars. The Tatar elite was scattered. Some fled to Crimea, some to the Ottoman Empire, some tried to rebel. But Kazan was lost. Then Astrakhan fell, then Sibir. One by one, the Tatar Khanates were swallowed by the rising Russian bear. Only Crimea remained, protected by its alliance with the Ottoman Empire. For a time it thrived. Crimean Tatars even raided deep into Russian territory, capturing prisoners and selling them in the slave markets of the Black Sea. But even that would not last forever. By the late 1700s, Catherine the Great annexed Crimea. The last independent Tatar Khanate was gone. And yet, again, the Tatars didn't disappear. They adapted. Some blended into Russian life. Others kept to their traditions, their language, their faith, their songs. In villages along the Volga, in the quiet back streets of Kazan, in whispers passed down through families, the memory of the horde survived. They were no longer the horsemen of terror. They were survivors of an empire that once ruled from China to Hungary, people with long memories and longer silence. But history had one more storm coming, because the Tatars were about to face something even more dangerous than empires. They were about to face modernity. Once the Tatars ruled. Now they lived under new rulers. The Russian Empire, expanding like a slow, relentless tide, had swallowed every Tatar Khanate except for one. And by the end of the 18th century, even Crimea, once protected by Ottoman might, was no longer free. But empires don't just conquer land. They try to conquer memory, and the Tatars remembered too much. They remembered being the horsemen of the steppe, the tax collectors of princes, the rulers of cities. And now they were being told they were just another minority, another group to be managed, catalogued, watched. In Kazan, once a Tatar capital, churches replaced mosques. Russian settlers flooded in. The Tatar language was pushed into the corners. The elite were squeezed out of power, slowly, systematically. But something curious happened. The Tatars didn't vanish, they adapted us again. Some became merchants, others became scholars. Many became deeply religious, holding tight to Islam like a root in a storm. Mosques remained, quiet but full. Children still learned to speak Tatar at home, even if the schools didn't teach it. And then came something unexpected. A spark. In the 19th century, a movement began among Tatar intellectuals. It was called the Jadid movement, a kind of Islamic reform that blended traditional faith with modern education. Instead of rejecting Russian rule outright, Jadids worked within the cracks. They built schools, taught science and history, published newspapers in Tatar. They dreamed of a new future, not one that returned to horse raids and tribute, but one where the Tatar people could hold on to who they were while still looking forward. For a time it worked. Kazan became a center of learning again. Tatar literature flourished. Poets and thinkers wrote about identity, about survival, about loss. They remembered their past, but didn't get stuck in it. But beneath all of this, pressure was building. The Russian Empire was not kind to minorities, and as the 20th century approached, the rules became stricter. Surveillance increased, dissidents disappeared, and revolution was brewing in the shadows, not just among the Russians, but across the empire. Then in 1917, everything broke. The Russian Revolution shattered the empire overnight. The Tsar was gone. The monarchy ended. Civil war exploded across the land. In the chaos, dozens of peoples, including the Tatars, saw a chance to finally shape their own future. For a brief moment, the idea of Tatar autonomy returned. Some dreamed of a Tatar-Bashkir republic in the Volga. Others called for an Islamic state. There were meetings, flags, speeches, but dreams don't always survive bullets. The Bolsheviks, the communist forces led by Lenin, won the Civil War. And once they had control, they weren't interested in anyone else's vision. At first, they tried something new, something called Korenizatsiya, indigenization. It meant letting local cultures flourish, letting minorities speak their languages, build schools, keep their names. Tatars benefited for a while. Kazan became the capital of a new Tatar autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Tatar was spoken in schools. Literature bloomed. Some exiled families returned. There was hope. But then Stalin came, and everything changed. Stalin didn't like diversity. He didn't like autonomy. He didn't like memory. What he wanted was obedience. The 1930s were a nightmare across the Soviet Union. But for minority groups like the Tatars, they were something worse. Mosques were shut down. Imams arrested, books burned. Intellectuals, the very Jadids who had worked so hard to modernize their people, were executed or sent to Siberia. Then came the forced relocations. It wasn't just Crimean Tatars. It was Chechens, Ingush, Volga Germans, dozens of groups. Stalin didn't trust them, especially during World War II. He called them traitors, without proof, without trial. And in 1944, the Crimean Tatars were ordered out. Entire families were loaded onto cattle trains. No warning, no preparation, no mercy. They were sent east, to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Siberia. Tens of thousands died along the way. Starvation, disease, exposure. Children froze in their mothers' arms. Elders were buried in shallow roadside graves. This wasn't war, this was erasure. When the Crimean Tatars were gone, The Soviet state wiped their name from the records, destroyed their cemeteries, renamed their towns, as if they had never existed. But they did. And they would not forget. In exile, the Tatars survived, and again. They learned new trades, built new homes, held their identity like a flame in the wind, secret language, secret stories, secret songs, all passed down in whispers. And they organized. For decades, the Crimean Tatars protested, wrote letters, held marches, pleaded for return. The Soviet government ignored them, until the 1980s, when the cracks began to show. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was cracking, not loudly, not suddenly, but like an old building whose foundation had begun to rot. Small tremors, quiet doubts, a deep sense that something was wrong, and had been wrong for a long time. And in the cracks, voices began to rise. Among them were the Crimean Tatars, scattered across Central Asia, still banned from their homeland, still marked as traitors. But now they were speaking out again. They wrote letters to Moscow, organized petitions, protested peacefully in the streets of Tashkent and Samarkand. Elderly survivors of the deportation told their stories. Young Tatars, born in exile, carried signs their parents never dared to hold. And the world was listening, and just a little more than before. Then came 1989. It wasn't freedom, not yet. But the Soviet government, under pressure and reform, admitted something incredible, that the deportation of the Crimean Tatars had been wrong. It was the first time the state had acknowledged any guilt. It didn't come with full rights or full return or even an apology, but it cracked the door open. And then, in 1991, the door was blown off its hinges. The Soviet Union collapsed. What had once been the largest country on Earth, one that stretched from Berlin to the Bering Sea, fell apart almost overnight. Russia became just Russia again. Ukraine became independent. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, dozens of new nations, and in the chaos, people returned home, including the Crimean Tatars. After nearly 50 years in exile, thousands began the long journey back to Crimea, some by train, some by foot, some with nothing but a name and a memory. But they were going home. Only home wasn't waiting for them. In their absence, others had taken their land, built homes over their villages, rewritten their history. The Tatars returned to a place that looked familiar, but didn't remember them. They weren't welcomed, not by everyone. They were called intruders, foreigners, troublemakers in their own ancestral homeland. But they stayed. They rebuilt mosques, planted gardens, reopened graveyards that had been bulldozed, taught their children the Tatar language again. They held on, stubborn and soft-spoken, just like they always had. And in 1991, the same year the USSR collapsed, the Tatars took another step. They formed the Mejlis, a representative council of Crimean Tatars, not a government but a voice, a way to organize, advocate, and protect their people. One of its early leaders was Mustafa Dzhemilev, a former Soviet dissident who had spent years in prison for defending Tatar rights. Quiet, fierce, unbroken. He once went on a hunger strike in prison for over 300 days. That's the kind of fire that exile doesn't put out. For the next 2 decades, Crimean Tatars worked, quietly, patiently, to re-establish their place in Crimean society. They weren't looking for revenge, just recognition. And for a moment, it looked like they might get it. Ukraine, newly independent, officially recognized the Tatars as a native people of Crimea. There were still struggles, still racism, still poverty, but things were moving. Then came 2014. Russia invaded Crimea. Tanks rolled across the border. Soldiers with no flags took control of government buildings. In a matter of days, Crimea was under Russian control. Again. It was a familiar story. But this time the Tatars didn't stay silent. They protested, boycotted the referendum, spoke out against the occupation, and the crackdown came fast. Tatar activists were arrested. The Mejlis was banned. Homes were raided, journalists disappeared, mosques were watched. Some were forced to flee. Again. It was a repeat of history, but with cameras. The world watched. Some spoke out, most moved on. But the Tatars didn't move. They stayed. They remembered. They taught. In Crimea, in Kazan, in Turkey, in Central Asia, across the diaspora, the Tatar people, once an empire, then a footnote, now a whisper, still speak. And what they say is this: we are still here, not as invaders, not as exiles, but as survivors of 1,000 years of storms. We were the ones who collected tribute from kings, the ones who built Sarai, who rode under the crescent, who buried our stories in the steppe wind. And we are the ones who refuse to be forgotten. If you want to find the heart of the Tatar people today, follow the Volga River. There, wrapped in the bend of the mighty water, lies Kazan. It's no longer the capital of a khanate. Not anymore. But in some ways it's more powerful now than it's ever been. Kazan is a city of symbols. Golden domes share a skyline with tall minarets. Russian language flows alongside Tatar. A Soviet past leans against Islamic roots, while digital billboards blink above ancient stone streets. It's not a contradiction. It's a survival story, told in layers. More than 1 million people live in Kazan now, and nearly half of them identify as Tatar. But being Tatar in the 21st century doesn't always look like it used to. They don't ride horses across the steppe anymore. They ride buses through traffic. They don't fight under banners of khans. They fight with ideas, votes, art, and sometimes silence. Yet even now, the soul is still there. You can taste it in the food. Warm chak-chak, sticky with honey and shaped by hand. Ekpochmak, the triangular meat pies passed down through generations. Rich lamb broth that smells like a grandmother's memory. You can hear it in the music. Haunting Kubi's melodies, ancient flutes and modern fusions that blend Tatar rhythms with pop and jazz. You can see it in weddings, in language classes, in poetry slams where teenagers recite verses in Tatar, not because they have to, but because they want to. And you can feel it in the quiet pride of a people who refuse to be erased. Modern Kazan is not a museum, it's alive. New generations are asking questions. What does it mean to be Tatar today? Is it religion, language, culture, a passport, a memory? There's no single answer. Some Tatars are deeply religious Muslims. Others are secular. Some speak fluent Tatar. Others struggle with the words their grandparents knew by heart. Some live in Kazan, others in Moscow or Istanbul or Toronto. And yet they are connected, not by borders, but by a shared past that pulses through the bones, a past that includes glory and pain. Because for many Tatars, being part of Russia still means walking a tightrope. On one hand, the state celebrates Kazan as a multicultural success. They promote the city, sponsor festivals, praise its economic growth. But beneath that pressure, the Russian government has pushed hard in recent years to reduce the teaching of non-Russian languages in schools. That includes Tatar. Once mandatory in the Republic of Tatarstan, Tatar language classes have been made optional. Many students now graduate unable to speak their own ancestral tongue. That's not an accident. That's a quiet erasure. And Tatars have noticed. Some resist through culture, writing in Tatar, filming documentaries, hosting language workshops online. The others fight through politics, though that's dangerous. Activists have been watched, threatened, and sometimes arrested under vague laws about extremism. And some simply hold the line. They teach their children Tatar at home. They pray in mosques their grandfathers built. They keep family stories alive at dinner tables. No protest signs, just presence. And then there are the memories of Crimea. Volga Tatars and Crimean Tatars are different branches of the same tree. Different histories, accents, customs, but they share the same roots, the same trauma. And when Crimean Tatars were once again pushed from their homeland after Russia's annexation in 2014, the Volga Tatars knew exactly what it meant, because they've seen it all before. Kazan remembers being conquered, burned, rebuilt. The steppe remembers the thunder of hooves, the silence of exile. The Tatars remember, and remembering is a kind of resistance. So they keep building. New schools, new books, new films, new songs. They speak 2 languages and live in 2 worlds. They laugh loud, dance at weddings, grieve their history, and dream forward. They are modern, ancient, Russian, Tatar, Muslim, secular, artists, farmers, coders, teachers, nomads of memory, a people without an empire, but not without a legacy. Because the true power of the Tatars was never just in horses or walls or khans. It was in endurance, in turning survival into tradition, silence into song, displacement into identity. And even now, after centuries of conquest, exile, return, and struggle, the Tatars are still writing their story. In bold ink, on living skin, with eyes wide open. Not every Tatar lives on the steppe. Some walk under the grey skies of Warsaw. Others sip tea in Istanbul, kneel in prayer in Brooklyn, raise their children in the sunlit kitchens of Almaty, Berlin, Toronto, or Dubai. They are the diaspora, the scattered seeds of a people who were once the storm. But now they are wind-carried memory, and memory knows how to travel. Some left by choice, others were pushed. Some fled Russian conquest centuries ago. Others escaped Stalin's deportations. Some came after the collapse of the Soviet Union in search of education, work, safety, a chance to breathe freely without watching what language they spoke, what books they read, what prayers they whispered at night. They brought with them very little, but also everything. Family names, spices in cloth pouches, wedding songs, black and white photographs of men in round caps and women in long dresses, a copy of the Quran wrapped in velvet, a story told 100 times by a grandfather who remembered the old country like a dream. And they built new lives. In Poland, Tatar communities date back over 600 years. Yes, centuries. There are still mosques there, simple and wooden, where Polish is spoken outside, but Tatar customs still live inside. Children play football after Eid prayers. Grandmothers roll dough the same way their mothers did in Crimea. In Turkey, many Tatars found refuge after Russia's imperial expansion. There, in the coffee houses of Ankara or the back streets of Istanbul, you'll find voices speaking soft Tatar mixed with Turkish, a living hybrid born of exile. In the United States, Tatars often arrived alone as students or refugees. Some kept quiet about where they came from. The word Tatar confused people, but quietly they gathered, formed cultural associations, cooked traditional meals for their neighbors, organized language classes for their kids, wrote newsletters to each other in Romanized Tatar just to stay connected. And in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, where Stalin had dumped the Crimean Tatars like ghosts, they endured, built schools, opened community centers, founded newspapers, in exile. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed and some returned to Crimea, many stayed. Their children had grown up in these lands, their roots had wrapped around new soil. But no matter where they are, one question follows every Tatar. What does it mean to belong? Is it a homeland, a passport, a language, a prayer? For some Tatars, identity is fragile, a thing passed down in fragments. They don't speak the language, don't wear traditional clothes, don't know the names of the Khans, but they know the food, the way their mother braided their hair, the way their grandfather refused to speak Russian even when it cost him. And that too is belonging, because being Tatar has never been about purity. It's been about presence, a presence that survives exile, absorbs pressure, evolves with dignity. Across the world, young Tatars are finding each other online. They're making music that blends hip-hop with steppe melodies, posting memes about Genghis Khan, learning the Tatar alphabet on Duolingo, starting podcasts about diaspora life, asking, who are we now? And there are no easy answers. Some feel more connected to the global Muslim world than to the Russian-speaking one. Others feel pulled between cultures, not quite Russian, not quite Turkic, not quite Eastern European. But all of them are holding something, a memory. They have horses, of exile, of songs, of names written in old scripts. And the memory is enough. It's enough to keep a language alive, to write a poem that no one else understands except your grandmother, and maybe the wind, to walk through a European city at night, hear church bells ring, and still imagine the call to prayer echoing from an invisible minaret. To say quietly but firmly, I am Tatar, not because it's easy, but because it's true. And truth, even whispered, even scattered, even forgotten by history books, endures. The Tatars in exile don't dream of conquest anymore. They dream of continuity. They don't seek revenge. They seek recognition. They don't ask the world to kneel. They ask it to remember, because as long as someone speaks their name, they haven't lost. History remembers conquerors. It builds statues for emperors, names cities after generals, and writes whole chapters about kings and revolutions and wars. But rarely does history remember the survivors, the ones who didn't build empires but lived through their collapse, the ones who weren't crowned but carried the story forward in silence, in kitchens, in exile. The Tatars were once feared, once powerful. They shook the world, changed the shape of maps, took tribute from princes, built mosques beside rivers, and ruled trade routes stretching across half of Eurasia. But that's not what makes their story remarkable. What's remarkable is that they're still here, not as ghosts, not as pages in a textbook, but as people, breathing, loving, creating, praying, singing, arguing about language on forums, making jokes in 3 dialects, telling bedtime stories about Khans and wolves and stars. Still here, after Russia burned their cities. Still here, after the Soviets erased their names. Still here, after exile, deportation, silence. Still here, and that matters. Because in a world obsessed with power, the Tatars are proof that survival is power. That endurance can be louder than conquest. That even if your monuments are torn down, Your name can still be written on the wind. It's in the tea shared quietly in Kazan, under yellow light and the smell of cardamom. It's in the whispers of a grandmother in Uzbekistan, telling her grandchild how her family once lived near the Black Sea before the soldiers came. It's in the hip-hop lyrics of a Tatar teenager, spitting bars about lost homes and split identity, with a beat made from a melody his great-uncle sang in exile. It's in the graveyards they found bulldozed, but still visited anyway. It's in the mosques they rebuilt, the schools they founded, the alphabets they switched between, the books they smuggled across borders, the letters they wrote in jail, the silent prayers they kept saying long after the state told them to stop. History may forget names, but it never forgets presence. And the Tatars have been present, through fire, through silence, through wind, not just in Crimea or Kazan, but in the heart of every place they touched, in every story they shaped. They are the thread running through the fabric of empires, the shadow cast by the steppe, the drumbeat beneath the surface, and today they continue. They teach their children not just about the past, but about the strength it takes to carry it forward. They speak Tatar, even if no one else around them does. They wear their identity not like armor, but like skin. Soft, permanent, unapologetic. Because for the Tatars, identity was never something given. It was something held, and they've held it, tighter than any crown, longer than any empire. The steppe may be quiet now. The Khan's long gone, the palaces ruined, the flags torn. But the people? The people remain. And that is how history survives. So here we are, from the windswept plains of the Eurasian steppe to quiet kitchens in exile, from thunderous hoofbeats beneath Mongol skies to lullabies whispered in a language nearly lost, from palaces made of stone and gold to memories made of fragments and flame. We've walked the story of the Tatars, not just as conquerors, not just as victims, but as a people whose power was never only in their past, but in their persistence. They've been called invaders, outlaws, ghosts, refugees, but in truth, they were builders of cities, of songs, of families, of faith, of stories that refused to vanish, even when no one seemed to be listening. And in the quiet corners of the world, they still tell those stories. Not always out loud, sometimes just with a glance, a prayer, a recipe, a child's name. But it's there. It's in the gentle insistence that identity matters, even when borders change, even when history forgets, even when silence stretches across generations. The Tatars remind us that legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the way a people return to themselves. So as the fire fades low and the night deepens around us, maybe we can carry something with us from their journey. A memory, a question, a whisper that says, we are still here, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what survival truly means. Not just staying alive, but staying known, even if only to each other. Thank you for walking this path tonight, for listening. Now let the quiet take over. Let the story settle. Let the stars above the steppe stretch across your ceiling. Let the wind of 1,000 years blow gently through your dreams. And sleep knowing that some stories never fade. They ride on. Always.